Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mireille and I'm the APCHA student. I would like to start my presentation with asking, is there anyone in this room who wouldn't like the Olympics to be held in their country? Well, it's only one person. And that is what the majority of surveys show, that most of the citizens in many different countries would like the Olympics to be held in their country. But why is it so, if hosting the Olympics brings advantages and disadvantages at the same time? So the topic of my presentation today is hosting the Olympics, and in particular the aim is to examine positive and negative effects of hosting the games, finding whether it is beneficial or not, and to suggest some recommendations. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them at the end of my presentation. So I'd like to start with introducing the outline of my presentation. So my talk today will be divided into 4 sections. First of all, I would like to introduce some information about the Olympics, providing brief history. Then I will move on to examine advantages of hosting the Games from economics and social perspectives. After that, I will consider disadvantages from 2 perspectives again. And finally, I will reach a conclusion suggesting some recommendations. I would also like to note that environmental aspect is outside the scope of this presentation due to the time limitations. So to begin with, what are the Olympics? They started as an athletic competition in ancient Greece and were held there every 4 years since 776 BC to 393 AD. Since 1896 they were revived, and currently Olympics are a major international sports event. Tracing the history of the Games, it can be noticed that currently Olympics appear to be a source of commercialization. And furthermore, if you look at the graphs, you can clearly see that the number of athletes, the number of sports and nations represented has increased significantly since the revival of the Games, showing a rising interest and participation in them. So, being a potential source of commercialization and becoming so much popular now are the main reasons for so many countries wanting to host the Games. Now, let us turn our attention to the advantages of hosting the Olympics. Firstly, it is claimed that Olympics help to boost the economy. This is mainly due to the increase in expected pattern of spending associated with the organization of the Olympics, development of infrastructure, and increased expenditure by visitors. For example, in Australia, the year following the Games, domestic and overseas visitors consumed 70.8 billion worth of goods and services. And an increase in GDP was observed across all other countries which have previously hosted the Games. However, I'd like to stress that the relative significance of such effects primarily depends on the scale of national and regional economy involved. In other words, the larger the hosting city and the smaller is the national economy in relation to it, the greater is the potential impact. And as the figures for income impulses show, the income impulses for the USA resulting from Atlanta's Games are 0.07% of GDP, whereas for Greece this figure is 4.1%, and the latter is almost 60 times greater. Now, the second advantage of hosting Games is that Games help to catalyze infrastructural investment, urban renewal, and regeneration, and therefore overall improvements in infrastructure. To give you an example, Barcelona estimated that within 8 years it had built infrastructure that would have normally taken 50 years to build. This is basically because governments are under such conditions, and everything for the Olympics has to be built within certain deadlines. And again, the same conditions apply to all the other countries hosting the Games. Now, another apparent benefit of hosting the Olympics is the rise in tourism. As you know, country hosting the Games attracts an increased number of visitors. And on average, the increase in tourism of the hosting country is 50% higher than the world's average. And what is more, as an example, the British Bridge the World Tour operator has reported that there was a 53% increase in the passenger bookings to Australia in the month following the Games. And of course, such increase in the number of tourists leads to increase in tourism revenues. And in Australian case, for example, the earnings from tourism went up by over £2 billion in the year 2001. Furthermore, hosting the Games brings an increase in the employment levels. And as an example, the 2008 Beijing Olympic Games created 1.8 million new jobs across across the economy. Those include works and jobs in buildings sector, wholesale and retail industries, and other sectors as well. And again, this is the general case for all the countries hosting the Olympics. Finally, hosting the Games brings, although sometimes intangible but nevertheless very important social benefits, which include international attention through the media coverage, which contributes directly to changing the country's image. The feel-good factor, which includes the pride and unity of the nation. Furthermore, it is the promotion of healthy living, which implies motivation and inspiring children as well as adults to actively participate in sports. And as the statistical data shows, majority of the citizens support the bid, and the majority of respondents think that intangible benefits are the most important, or at least as equally important as tangible benefits. So is it clear so far? Well, then, having considered the advantages, let us move on to the disadvantages. So, on the other hand, hosting the Olympics requires large sums of money. Can you imagine? The bidding process alone is estimated to cost each city between $15 to $20 million. And what is more, the planned expenditures tend to increase significantly. For example, Sydney went 100% over the budget. And in particular, building and upgrading infrastructure is the sector that usually requires greater expenditures than initially planned. To give you an example, the upgrading cost of the Hindmarsh Soccer Stadium in Australia went up from an original estimate of 8.5 million Australian dollars to an eventual cost of 30 million Australian dollars. This is quite a significant difference between the plan and actual costs. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to the chart which shows the planned Olympic budget, and taking into account that expenditures on infrastructure and other sport facilities constitute more than 2/3 of the budget, and those are the expenditures that tend to rise considerably, we can imagine how greatly the budget is likely to rise. Now, continuing the consideration of economic aspect leads us to the following. As I'm sure you are aware, hosting the Olympics requires creation of a very specific infrastructure, such as 80,000 all-seated stadium, archery sites, equestrian paths, and others. Although it is usually claimed that Games will leave long-term legacy with a number of new and renovated venues available for use by athletes and ordinary people, the reality shows that actually some of the infrastructure will not be used after the Games at all, whereas some of it will remain underutilized. This consequently leads to high maintenance costs at the government's expense. And here's an example. It is estimated that maintenance and management of the Olympic Park in Australia would cost approximately $5 million per year. Now, let us move on to the social disadvantages. As you know, government expenditures on the Olympics are great, and they also affect the society. For example, the USSR government ran into $9 billion deficit for hosting the 1980 Olympic Games. Of course, the burden of such debt lies on the citizens of the city in the form of taxes which they have to pay. And not only the costs are huge, but the rise in prices due to increasing demand appears to be significant as well. And to illustrate with an example, the citizens of Atlanta had to pay double the water rates they did before the Games. So, to summarize, let me just go over the main points again. The presentation has clearly shown that hosting the Olympics brings advantages, which include boosting the economy, improving infrastructure, attracting foreigners and thus increasing tourism revenues, rising the employment levels, attracting international attention, experiencing the feel-good factor, and promoting healthy lifestyles. And on the other hand, hosting the Olympics brings disadvantages, which include running a government deficit, rising the tax burden for the citizens, possibility of high inflation, and high maintenance costs. Now, in conclusion, having examined the advantages and disadvantages of hosting the Olympics leads me to a conclusion that from economic and social perspectives, hosting the Games brings more advantages than disadvantages. However, several recommendations are suggested in order to make sure that the disadvantages are limited. So first of all, Careful and accurate plans should be made with precise estimates of all the costs, expenditures, and benefits. Furthermore, private investments should be attracted in order to reduce government expenditures and overruns. Furthermore, price ceilings might be introduced in the cases when anticipated inflation is high. And also, the post-Olympic utilization of the sports infrastructure should be planned in advance and should be practically viable. And finally, it is also important that the scale of the regional economy, of the city economy, in relation to the regional and national economy is an important determinant. The larger the city and the smaller the national economy, the greater is the potential impact, as the examples of Athens has shown. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer them now.
Thank you very much, Mireille. I do have a couple of questions. First of all, generally talking about the benefits, you mentioned the increase in GDP, the increased employment, and also the social benefits, the feel-good factor, the promoting healthy living. My question is, do you think those benefits are short-term only?
No, I wouldn't say that. First of all, some of the benefits are short-term and some of them are long-term. And first of all, some of them start as acting as benefits before the games and continue till the end, whereas some will start only after the games. For example, the increase in GDP doesn't appear immediately. It is not a short-term effect. It's rather a long-term, because to have an increase in GDP sometime needs to pass, because all those expenditures, they need to go through the economic cycle of all those income, of change in money, and so on. And the effects of the increase in GDP will be seen only later. While some of it, such as increase and improvements in infrastructure, are the immediate effects because you can see them straight away.
Yes, but for example, this example you gave, I think it was Australia, the increase in GDP. Well, of course, you gave the year 2001, the year after the games. Did that continue? Do you know?
Yes, I know that continued, and I had figures for the next 4 years, but I don't have them with me right now. But they show that the greatest increase in the tourism revenues was the year during the games and the year after the games. Since then, the increase was greater than the years before that, before the games. But after that, they slightly decreased.
So it is kind of short-term in a way.
Well, the increase in tourism might be short-term, but the increase in GDP is long-term, because all those investments in infrastructure, building, and all of that, they go through the cycle, as I said before, and they bring the long-term results.
Okay, and on the same point, but with the social benefits, just to question, promote healthy living. Yeah, a lot of the time people are sitting at home watching them. I don't think they're outside playing sport, and I think people are quite fickle. It's in their mind. While the Olympics is on, everyone's very excited, but once it's finished, do people really follow up? They start running, start playing tennis, or whatever. What do you think?
I understand you. That is what some people think. But as I did my research, I found some information that in some countries, and they give particular examples, and I can give you the source later if you want, the people, they didn't only watch the games, but because of the improvements in infrastructure and the appearance of the sport venues, it allowed citizens to use those venues as well as the athletes, and the number of children and adults participating in different kinds of sport has increased. It wasn't a very great increase, but the numbers were between 1% and 7%, which I think is quite significant for a nation.
Yeah, good. Okay, final question. Just if you could go back to your slide, I think it was the first disadvantages slide about the costs of the bid, and you had the Beijing example, the pie chart, slide 9, I think.
Yeah.
I wasn't entirely clear on this slide, so could you just briefly explain it again and tell me the significance?
Yeah. The chart shows the planned expenditures, planned budget, and it shows the budget with respect to different sectors. So the greatest part of the budget is, of course, spent on infrastructure. The second greatest part is the investment in the environment, because there are strict regulations for the environment safety. Also, these are the expenditures on stadiums and other sport venues. These are the operational expenditures, which include like like lighting the fire, bringing the guests and all of that. And this is the security and safety expenditures. And as you can see from the chart, the infrastructure and the sport venues, they constitute the greatest share. And the point was that these two expenditures are the ones that tend to increase significantly.
Yes.
So if this was the initial expenditure, initial planned cost for the sector, and it increases almost twice or even greater as we have seen on the examples, we can imagine how the whole thing is likely to increase.
Okay, so it's an expensive
It is an expensive.
operation. Do you know, perhaps you don't have these figures, but do you know if for any previous Olympic Games, is there any evidence or any figures to show if the expense that went in, the cost that was reimbursed, was actually greater or?
Well, I don't have the figures with me right now, you're right, but what I remember is that Atlanta, the US Atlanta Games, the Los Angeles Games that were held in 1984, they were the first games which left government with 225 million surplus. So although the expenditures were great, the government ended up with a surplus.
And
But-
have any other countries followed their model to?
Yeah, there are some other countries, but I don't remember the figures right now. However, at the same time, there are countries who experienced large budget deficits, such as USSR
Greece.
and also Montreal. They had a $1 billion deficit. So it really depends with the countries. And if you look closely, you can understand that most of the countries which ran into deficit, the scale of the city with relation to the country's economy is great. While the USA, it is obvious that Atlanta is quite small with relation to the whole other country, so they are able to get benefits and economic benefits from that.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you very much, Marie.
Thank you.